So, which ethnocultural groups are the most endangered? It's an interesting question because I kind of feel with the specter of globalism, in some ways, nearly all ethnic groups in the world are potentially endangered on a long enough timeline. Although, yes, there are some groups like the Han Chinese that are just so numerous that it's hard to see them ever becoming truly endangered. But nonetheless, I mean, I think with this this race blender and culture blender that is being imposed on the world as a whole, with the specter of globalization, globalism, and multiculturalism, uh, we have to look at which groups are most threatened by it in the immediate sense. Now, I'm going to be focusing on groups of either Western or Western adjacent origin because that's the background I come from. It's the part of the world that I'm most familiar with. Also, because frankly, the Western world has been targeted more by globalism, like compared to, say, East Asia. I mean, East Asia, as with all the world, I think they do face threats from globalism, but I think they are, for the time being, safer than we are, simply because their governments, their corporate elite, their elite as a whole are just pushing the globalist agenda less aggressively than ours is. But I'm going to be looking at the groups that I think are the most immediately endangered. And as I'm saying, I'm focusing on groups that are either, Western in the broadest sense of the term, like people of white European descent, or people who are either like adjacent or closely linked to peoples of European descent. So at number 10 on the list, I'm going to put the Portuguese. Now, the Portuguese are the only ones on this list who actually form a nation, like an actual country where they are the dominant ethnic group, which is Portugal. But from my travels in Europe, more so than any other nationality with its own country, I see the Portuguese as being potentially endangered. And the reason for this is a combination of factors. Firstly, they have a very low birth rate. Secondly, they're not a huge country. It's, I believe, around 10 million people. Thirdly, there's a high rate of emigration because a lot of Portuguese leave for wealthier countries. They leave for countries in Northern Europe. I don't think quite as many come to North America these days because I don't see many like new Portuguese immigrants. If there are people who are ethnically Portuguese who are new arrivals here, they're more Portuguese by way of Brazil. Um, but I think the actual like ethnic Portuguese from Portugal, when they emigrate, they tend to go more to Northern Europe. Like I saw a lot of them in Luxembourg, for instance, and apparently there's a lot in like Jersey and other English speaking island communities. Also, from what I've heard, there's a lot in Switzerland. So, yeah, emigration is a factor, but also immigration, because they, like other Western European countries, have seen a lot of mass immigration from parts of what could be called the third world or semi third world countries. Now, here's what the big difference is. The big difference is why I put the Portuguese is more endangered than other European ethnicities is because historically Portugal has had more of a culture of promoting mixing. Like they did this in their colonies, but they also to some extent have done this locally. Like I believe there was an African slave population that was kind of absorbed into the local gene pool in the like 18th and 19th centuries. Not a huge population, but still a noticeable one. And to this day, I think the culture of mixing persists there more than in other European countries. I would say even more so than in Spain. Like, I would say Spain has been affected less by reverse migration and reverse colonization from its former colonies than Portugal has. And I'd say on a cultural level, there's this idea of lusotropicalism, this idea of like, you know, of integration with their former colonial subjects through mixing. But I think the thing with this is there's a very high number of Brazilians in particular in Portugal, and many of them are not just ethnic Portuguese Brazilians. A lot of them are mixed. And I think with this comes the increasing Brazilification of Portugal. It's not just Brazilians, like there's Africans also. But yeah, unlike most of Western Europe, Portugal's migrants are not overwhelmingly Muslim. There's actually very few Muslims in Portugal. And I think what that's leading to is there's a bit less animosity and a bit less of a sense of like us and them between the Portuguese and the migrant populations compared to other European countries. But I guess the upshot of that is less ethnic tension, less violence. But the downside of that is that I think the assimilation of the Portuguese into this identity that's frankly not specifically Portuguese, but more like, I guess, part of the broadly speaking, like Lusosphere, but like more Brazilian than anything. Like this new identity, this more like, yeah, like Lusosphere identity as opposed to like a specifically Portuguese one. I see it as actually being more of a threat there than in other European countries because the cultural closeness makes the assimilation more likely. And I would put it in this area which makes it especially vulnerable where you have a culture that is close enough that it can assimilate them quite easily, but far enough that I would argue that it does constitute the potential extinction of a certain cultural group. Like far enough in a cultural sense, in a racial sense, in an ethnic sense. So yeah, I think the Portuguese are actually more vulnerable than any other European nationality for those reasons, to being essentially vulnerable to going extinct or becoming severely endangered to the point of being a small minority and not really being dominant anywhere. So like I would actually say, yeah, more so than any other European nationality. The next on the list would be the white Latin Americans. Now, the question of whether white Latin Americans constitute a distinct culture is debatable. Like they definitely, I think, like obviously there are distinct racial groups within Latin America, but some people will be like, well, are white Latin Americans really a unique culture? I mean, I would say in some countries, definitely yes. I mean, I would say, for instance, in Argentina, in Uruguay, in southern Brazil, there is definitely a certain cultural identity that was created by different waves of European immigrants during the 19th century and early 20th century that distinguished them from much of the rest of Latin America, where they became more like these places actually became more European over time, and that influenced their culture greatly, like their food, their music, their dances, things like that, where it's a much more European style culture. And I would say it's existed long enough, it's long established enough that yes, it is a distinct culture and it does merit preservation as a distinct culture. Whereas, say, for instance, if you're talking about like white Guatemalans or white El Salvadorians, I think you could argue, yeah, I mean, from a genetic standpoint, there's definitely reasons for desiring racial preservation. But are they a distinct culture in and of themselves? I would say they have less of a case for that because it's like, I'd argue in these countries like Guatemala or El Salvador, the dominant culture is more just this mestizo culture. And even like the more upper class whites are kind of integrated into that culture to a great extent. And I'd argue like the existence of a separate white culture there or European culture is more debatable. Whereas in places in like Argentina, Uruguay, southern Brazil, I'd say it's much less debatable. I'd say, yes, there definitely is a distinct European culture, white culture in that part of South America. And I would say it's comparable in some ways to say like white Canadians or white Americans, like relative to, other groups in Canada or the United States. Like it's essentially a new world white culture, a new world culture of European extraction, or like say, yeah, white Australians or white New Zealanders. Like I would say those are cases where the European derived peoples do have a legitimate claim to a distinct cultural identity. And I would say, yeah, in places like Argentina, Uruguay, southern Brazil, maybe Chile. I'm not quite as familiar with Chile and the exact nature of the society there. I would say those parts of Latin America, basically the southern cone, and maybe some adjacent regions of central Brazil, like maybe Sao Paulo. It gets a bit iffy around there, about around like Sao Paulo, Minas Gerais, Rio de Janeiro, but definitely southern Brazil. Um, yeah, I'd say they have more of a claim to being a distinct culture and having a distinct cultural identity and being a distinct group. So yeah, I would say that's a group for similar reasons as I mentioned for Portugal, because there's immigration in Brazil. It's mostly immigration within the same country, like from northern and central Brazil into southern Brazil. In Argentina and Uruguay, it's mostly international immigration from other parts of South America, like from Paraguay, Bolivia, Peru, Venezuela, Ecuador, other countries like that, basically. And it actually there have been large waves of those immigrants. I think still are today. And as with Portugal, I think the assimilation is actually happening faster there because there's more cultural similarities and like linguistic similarity, religious similarity. But I would argue, despite these similarities, like it's enough similarities that the assimilation is happening faster compared to, say, a country like Germany or even here in Canada, where there's more of a sense of us and them between us versus the immigrants that are coming here. Whereas, yeah, in say Portugal or like Argentina, there is that sense to an extent, but there's also some enough commonality that I think there's less of that distinction. But there is enough of a distinction that I would argue that what's happening is essentially the threat of these distinct cultural groups being bred out of existence. Like, for instance, in southern Brazil, there's even a significant German population. And in some parts of southern Brazil, I think historically Oktoberfest has been a more major celebration than Carnival. Now, I'm not sure if that's still the case. Are they now on more equal footing, or is Carnival bigger now, or is Oktoberfest still bigger? I don't know, but I think that's very interesting. And I think that there is a distinct culture. Like, I believe, like, for instance, the styles of dance that are common in Argentina that are associated with Argentina are much more European derived in nature. And I know they have a big opera house there. And like, or is it an opera house or a theater? Well, either way, like they do have like more of a history of like there's more popularity among types of music, like say classical music, things that are traditionally associated with European culture, like in that part of South America, like the Southern Cone, compared to other parts of South America. So I do think, yes, there is, and of course there's their own unique spin on it. Like there's many unique subcultures and different cultural traits that are specifically associated with the Southern Cone, like the gauchos, for instance, compared to, say, other parts of Latin America, where I think it's just more of a mestizo identity that just dominates everything. So the group I'd put at number 8 are some of the Celtic groups, like specifically the Welsh, the Scottish, the Irish, not so much in Ireland itself, but in Northern Ireland, and the Bretons, actually, in France. And the reason is, in these cases, I think the assimilation, like obviously they face assimilation from mass immigration, as does all of Western Europe. But I think in their case, the biggest immediate threat is assimilation by other whites being like the main ethnicity there, and either the English or the French. And I think that these groups are distinct enough that it does constitute a potential major cultural loss if these groups cease to exist. Like compared to, say, like some of these like languages, like say Lombard or Provençal and the ethnic group associated with them. You could argue, well, these are close enough. Like Provençal identity is close enough to French identity that if they're assimilated out of existence, it doesn't really matter that much. Whereas I think with like Celtic identity, it's distinct enough from like English or French identity in terms of both the language and other cultural traditions that I think, yes, it does constitute a distinct group that is being highly threatened. Now, in this case, again, like it's a bit different in the sense that immigration is a factor, but I think actually the main factor here is peaceful assimilation by essentially the dominant white group there, like the dominant nationality or culture there. But yeah, I think that they factor on the list too for that reason. Number 7. Now this group, some may debate that this is even a group, but I think they actually are in a way, is the White Turks. Now, for those who don't know, the term White Turks, it's both racial and cultural. It does refer to like Turks who are more white looking, but it's also a cultural identifier of just Turks who identify more with European culture and with the idea of a Turkish Europeanized identity. Basically, people who follow Kemalism, who revere Ataturk, and who support the idea of Turkish secularism. Now, I think they actually, in some ways, like with Turkey, they're kind of a bridge country between Europe and the Middle East. And I would argue that like they're being caught between two different civilizational identities. Something like I would argue that these identities are distinct enough that it actually does make them kind of like an ethnic group in their own way, like the different factions of Turks, even if they're part of technically the same ethnic group. But because the question of Turkish identity is so inherently fraught and caught between two very polarized identities, I would say that the more Europeanized Turks, in a way, almost do constitute their own ethnic group. And it's interesting, I saw a survey of how Turks identify themselves. It was something like 92% of the Turkish population sees themselves as more Middle Eastern, whereas 8% saw themselves as more European. And I would wager there's definitely a geographical distribution, like a very uneven distribution there, where I'm sure that 8% is disproportionately in the western parts of Turkey. And those parts have seen massive immigration from other parts of Turkey as well as from other Muslim countries. And it definitely is changing the cultural makeup there. And not just the culture, but the politics too. Like Erdogan proudly identifies as what they call a black Turk. Like obviously they're not literally black, but they're like Turks who generally are darker skinned and identify more with the Middle Eastern culture and the idea of being religiously Islamist, like theocratic. Yeah, like I mean that. Yeah, I mean I've read the statistics on demographic change in Turkey. It's actually changing faster there than in Western Europe. Like when you look at both internal migration within Turkey and then external migration from other Muslim countries, they're actually getting replaced at a faster rate than Western Europeans. And frankly, it's the same issue as in Portugal and among the white Latin Americans, where with the white Turks, there's enough cultural similarities to like what the people call themselves the Black Turks, and also to like other Muslim ethnic groups that are immigrating into Turkey, that like the specter of rapid fire, like blitzkrieg level assimilation is much higher there. So that's why I would put them on this list. Now the next one is the Basques. Now the Basques, I think, again, like the way I'm grading them on this list, it's not necessarily by just how much danger they're in, but also how unique these groups are. And the Basques, I actually think might be in less danger than some of these other groups. But I will say, like, ethnoculturally, they're an extremely unique group in terms of their language, in terms of their ethnic identity. I would actually say they're in less danger because, unlike some of these other groups, they actually do have some protections as an official minority in Spain. And they're recognized as like one of the only indigenous groups in Europe, which is kind of bullshit because like aren't all Europeans indigenous to some part of Europe? But nonetheless, I will say as a ethnocultural linguistic isolate, the Basques do have the right to feel threatened. And again, they're mostly threatened by the prospect of integration into wider Spanish society. Like there's immigration into Spain too. That's also a threat. But I would say the main threat to them is assimilation into Spanish society. So yeah, they're next on this list. After that is the French Canadians at at number 5. Now the French Canadians, there was a few years ago, I would have said they're not really threatened at all because they have some pretty strict language laws and they've been managing to protect their identity pretty well. But in recent years, that's starting to change ever since the big event in 2020. I believe interprovincial migration for the first time ever, there were more people moving into Quebec from other provinces than out of it. And the English language has actually been in decline in Quebec for a while, but it's actually starting to increase again. And I think the main things that are making this happen is number one, immigration, because a lot of immigrants from third party countries like whose first language is neither English nor French prefer English. And secondly, I think remote work, like the spread of remote work ever since the big event in 2020 has meant that a lot more people can suddenly live in Quebec, but they're not bound by Quebec's language laws in terms of like where like their workplace. Like they could live in Quebec but remotely work at an English speaking job. It's a lot easier to do that now. So I think all those factors combined, like yes, French Canadians are a distinct society and they do have reason to feel threatened, both by immigration and by assimilation into English Canada, English North American culture more broadly. So yeah, I mean, yeah, they're definitely on this list. Like they have the right to feel demographically threatened. Number 4 is white South Africans. Now, white South Africans, I mean, everybody's quite familiar with their predicament. The interesting thing is they actually have one of the highest birth rates of any white people on the planet. Their population actually, even though it decreased as a percentage, it increased in raw numbers, I think, on the latest census figures. Now, why is that? I think poverty and persecution actually lead to people having higher birth rates, as we can see with like the Palestinians. And I think with the white South Africans, there's this increased sense, and also the Israelis too, because they perceive themselves as being persecuted. But yes, I think the white South Africans have every reason to feel persecuted. And there's also increasing amounts of poverty due to affirmative action policies there that shut them out of the workforce. So yeah, those things I think have actually led to a higher birth rate. Because people who perceive themselves as persecuted and who are poor tend to fuck more and they tend to have more kids. I guess because they can't afford to do anything else for entertainment. And also because they feel they have to have kids to defend their people, like to keep their numbers up. So yeah, I mean, I think for those reasons, white South Africans, despite declining as a percentage of the population, they're actually safer than other whites in terms of raw numbers in some ways. There's also a low rate of mixing between them and the other racial groups in South Africa, but nonetheless, there's emigration and there's just the threat of persecution by the ANC or the AFF or, you know, other government parties like black political parties in South Africa, and by also just militias or whoever is doing these farm killings. So yeah, there's a lot of persecution there, but at the same time, they also have certain, from a cultural preservation standpoint, they also have certain advantages, bizarrely, over other white and Western people. But nonetheless, I think in the sense of immediate physical persecution, they face more of a threat than probably any other white people on the planet. Also, the Afrikaans language, I think, is legitimately endangered because they've actually tried to suppress it at universities there. Like Stellenbosch University, I think, actually banned Afrikaans from being used as a language of instruction, even though it's historically an Afrikaner university. I think it's historically like the most important Afrikaner university. I could be wrong, but also there were even cases of Afrikaans students being told not to speak Afrikaans in their dorm rooms there, which is absurd. But yeah, I mean, the Afrikaans language definitely is under threat, but so I mean, you could look at white South African identity like on multiple levels, like the white identity as a whole, and then the Afrikaner identity more specifically. And then there's the English South African identity. I don't really know what's going on with that group so much, but I think a lot of them have left. But the ones that are still there, yeah, there's them too, I guess. But yeah, so next on the list is Middle Eastern Christians. Now, Middle Eastern Christians, I believe there's about 20 million of them in the Middle East in total, more or less. It includes a very broad range of different ethnicities and denominations. In their case, the main threat is like violent persecution, emigration, because there's a lot of emigration to Western countries and also to Latin America. And also the threat of assimilation, like religious assimilation. A lot of Middle Eastern Christians do convert to Islam, and I think a lot more than the opposite, like Muslims, they're converting to Christianity. So yeah, I would put them on the list because I do think they are threatened in many ways. And again, they're not really a Western group per se, but they're Western adjacent enough that I felt I could put them on this list. The number 2 is Uralic or Finno-Ugric peoples of Russia, and also the Sami people in Scandinavia, although I think they're a bit more protected because they're viewed as indigenous there, although for some reason the Swedes and Norwegians and Finns are not seen as indigenous, but the Sami are. But nonetheless, I think the Sami are a bit safer, but I think some of these other groups in Russia, I would be concerned about their long-term prospects, like the Mari, the Komi, the Udmurt people. And they do have a lot of unique traits. Like the Mari people are still largely pagan, and the Udmurt people are the most redhead people on the planet, even more than the Irish. So they have a lot of unique like physical traits, religious traits, cultural traits, and a lot of these groups aren't overly numerous, and they don't have high birth rates, and there is a threat of assimilation, with the broader Russian population and also with various immigrant groups coming into Russia. So yeah, I'd put these groups pretty high on the list. Ones I would be concerned about, and I do think they're a very distinct groups culturally. And the number 1 I'm going to say is Louisiana French. And this is a group that is so endangered that like I do question if they have any chance at all at this point, because the French language in Louisiana has been dying for quite a while. The numbers have been diminishing. There's definitely still a sense of French culture there, but their continued existence, like the Cajuns, the Creoles, like any kind of French cultural group in Louisiana, yeah, definitely strong threat. And even when I was in New Orleans, like, to be honest, even the New Orleans accent seems threatened. Like, I heard a lot of people just speaking generic American accents there, even people who lived there. So I don't know. I would put Louisiana French, both in a linguistic and cultural sense, at like, frankly, the top of the list, because I think they're a very distinct culture, but also one that is quite threatened by like assimilation into the broader American culture. So yeah, that's the list.